Okay, Primary 6, here is chapter 5 and 6 of Light and Dumyat. The Fiery Cross. Breathless, Gavin stopped beside a tumble of boulders. It's no good, he thought. I'll never get down there. There's nothing for it but to go right over the crest of Dumyat and try to work my way down the other side. He didn't really like the way up the top. All he could see ahead was a tangle of boulders, as if some giant had hurled down handfuls of pebbles big as houses. They looked pretty steep. Picking his way carefully, he clambered slowly upwards. It was easier than he thought. He found himself enjoying the sensation of looking for the next place to put his feet. It was rather like climbing up an erratic staircase. Soon the boulders began to be less steep, and he crossed little patches of tough grass and moss. On the top of the mountain stood a small cairn, made of stones piled on top of one another. Gavin sank down beside it to get his breath back. He felt rather puffed. Still, it was all downhill after this. Looking up, he saw a view that took his breath away. The peak of Dumyat stood at one end of the Ochils. At its foot were the deep woods that surrounded Uncle Fergus's house and the nearby farm. A flat plain dotted with farms and trees and crossed by a shining river stretched before him. On the horizon were endless rows of mountains. They seemed even bigger than the Ochil Hills. Gavin's eyes shone with excitement as he looked around. Why, some of the mountains were even topped with snow, although it was early July. What a tale he would have to tell when he got back to the house. He whipped his map out and tried to identify some of the hills. The Ochil stretched greenly before him, rounded hills broken by clefts filled with trees and singing burns, with a rougher looking moorland lying beyond. He began to study the names of some of the hills as Aunt Elspeth had suggested. But peculiar names, he thought. Culsnor, White Wisp, King's Seat, Craig Leith. He tried to puzzle out their meanings, then he gave up. I'll ask Aunt Elspeth when I get back, he thought. He munched through a couple of sandwiches while he sat down. Then he remembered his quest. Hurrying to his feet, he began to run down the slope of the hill towards a bowl-shaped depression he had seen on the map. Once he slipped on the grass, sliding head over heels and tearing his anorak. But speed was the thing. He had wasted enough time already. As he trotted on, his brain worked furiously. He must get down before the fire died out. The hills were so large and confusing that he would need the smoke to find the exact spot. Soon he found the bowl and looked over. A gentle slope covered in loose stones and sparse grass lay before him. He hurtled downhill in great leaps that caused a clatter of falling stones. In no time he was at the side of the shoulder where he had seen the little valley and the figures. He stopped and he listened. Then he sniffed. He could distinctly smell burning wood. He hurried up the side of the shoulder, leaping from stones and scrambling on the grass. He was beginning to get better at hurrying on steep places. Below him lay the little valley. Gavin gazed around warily. It was about the size of a small room, covered in smooth turf and bounded on three sides by steep rocks. Down one wall tumbled the little burn he had seen from the crest. At the open end of the valley, the burn disappeared into a grove of trees and then spilled down the hillside. It seems a very secret place, thought Gavin as he gazed around. He wriggled forward on his stomach until he was on the verge of the turf. No one seemed to be about. Beside the burn, the little fire still crackled and hissed, sending up its plume of smoke. Gavin crept forward. There was no sign of life. He even leaned on the banks of the stream and looked into the brown water in case there was a hidden cave tucked away below the rocks. Tracks! That's it, he thought. Remembered the pictures in the book of animal tracks. They must have left tracks. Dumping his rucksack on the ground, he began to examine the grass. Sure enough, he could see where it had been trampled, and 3 places where it looked as if someone had been lying down. But the tracks didn't lead anywhere. I must think this out carefully, Gavin decided. He took off his anorak, spread it on the grass, and lay down in the sun. He felt quite hot after all that running and climbing. He glanced at his watch. He'd plenty of time before he had to set off home. It was so peaceful lying in the sun, watching the reflections in the water and on the rocks. Gavin removed his boots and socks and paddled in the cold water before sprawling once more on his anorak. His mind turned the problem over and over. Where would a person go if he did not want to leave tracks? The footprints had shown in the grass that in a little patch of muddy shingle at the water's edge, and had vanished. Then it struck him. He gazed at the soaring grey rocks that walled in the little valley, and had a sudden thought. That's it. They climbed up the rocks. They wouldn't leave footprints there. Gavin was right, and wrong. The mysterious people had climbed the rocks, but regular footprints will mark even rock. And soon he found them. He examined a rib of rock that led up to a tangle of boulders above the pool. It seemed to be polished. It was almost as if many feet passing that way had worn down the rock. Here and there, he noticed, were tiny scratches. Excited, he began to climb up. Soon he was well above the pool. He gazed down. If I fell from here, he thought, I'd fall right in that water. The rocks levelled out to a kind of platform. The scratches and smooth bumps ended in front of some moss-covered rocks. Gavin searched around in all directions. It was impossible to climb any higher. The slabs were too steep for that. Defeated, he sat down and gazed around. He took his knife out and idly started to scrape the moss from the rock. The moss came away easily. Too easily. Gavin sat up. Quickly, he scraped away more until he had cleared a space a few centimetres square. Underneath the moss was a large piece of wood. Gavin, his heart pumping with excitement, did some more scraping. He uncovered more wood. It seemed to be a door covered with moss. He felt carefully around it until he had identified the edges. I'd better not scrape off too much moss, he thought, in case anyone comes up here. He picked up some grass and dirt from beside the rock and smeared the sections he had scraped away. That looked better. There must be a catch or lever here somewhere, Gavin thought. He opened the longest blade of his knife and ran it round the edges of the door between the wood and the rock. There was a slight click. The door swung open. Gavin pulled it wide. Ahead lay a dark passage. He could only see into it a short way, and then it curved sharply out of sight. It was large enough to crawl into. Feverishly, he searched in his rucksack until he found his torch. He fastened the flex from the headpiece onto the battery section and put it securely in his rucksack at the top. He adjusted the head straps until the torch was comfortable on his forehead. Now he was ready. He switched it on. A strong beam shot from the torch and pierced the darkness. Gavin crawled into the passage. Once inside, he turned around and examined the door from the inside. 2 large wooden posts were at each side of the entrance. The wooden door was fixed to one of them by metal hinges. It wasn't a thick door, but the front had been covered with a kind of cement into which were stuck pebbles and rocks and moss until it looked like any of the hundreds of boulders that scattered the hill. There's a little picture of Gavin's perspective. Gavin pulled the door closed behind him. He made sure he knew how to open it again. It was fastened with a simple lever clutch, the sort that can be seen on any garden gate. Anyone entering simply used a thin blade as Gavin had done. The catch couldn't be seen from the outside, and if you knew where to insert the blade, there would be no need to scrape away any moss. Feeling every bit a real explorer, and slightly frightened as well, Gavin crept slowly forward. Ahead of him he saw daylight. The tunnel turned sharply left into what looked like a large cave. Light was pouring in from a gash high in one corner under the rocky roof. Gavin stood up and looked around. What had he found? He seemed to be in some kind of den or hiding place. The cave was large, big enough to hold 7 or 8 people standing up. It was dry and airy. His heart thudding, Gavin looked around. On the floor lay 2 large skins from some brown animal. 3 wooden benches stood against the wall. A long plank set on supports looked as if it was used as a table. Hanging on the wall was a lantern. Beside it, on pegs, were 3 bows with tin of arrows on the ground beneath. Gavin gingerly examined the bows. They were about his size, made from some kind of springy wood with strong string to shoot the arrow. The arrows had sharp points, with feathers up the opposite side. Gavin could hardly believe his eyes. His feet stumbled over a box that was big enough to sit on. Opening it up, he found it full of books and crockery. At the back of the cave hung a large tartan blanket. It covered most of one wall. Below it on 3 small pegs hung 3 pieces of tartan cloth. Gavin examined them. They looked like sashes. Each was a different tartan. One was red, the second green, and the third red with a blue and green line. Gavin didn't know what to make of it all. He examined everything very carefully. He kept making more finds in the dim light. In one corner was something like a round shield. It was made of wood, covered with an animal's skin and studded with iron nails. In the middle was a prong like the point of a spear. Gavin felt it. It was not very sharp. Below the gash in the wall was a long, thick pole with little notches cut in it. Gavin could not puzzle out what these were for. He opened up another box. Inside was a roll of tartan cloth. Opening it up carefully, he could feel something hard inside. He unrolled it slowly, but out fell the object with a clatter at his feet. Gavin picked it up. It was a dagger. It was about half a metre long with a black handle. At the end of the handle was some fine silver work clasping an orange-coloured stone. The blade was sharp and shining. It had a scabbard of black leather also covered in silver. Gavin carefully wrapped it up again and stowed it away in its box. He glanced at his watch. Gosh! Was that the time? He would have to hurry to be home on schedule. Making sure everything he had found was left the way he found it, he hurried back to the entrance. He listened carefully before slipping outside. The bright sun dazzled his eyes after the half-light of the cave. He sat for a moment or two until he could see again. Then he closed the door behind him and began to clamber down the rocks. Looking back, he thought to himself, how well hidden was that cave? No one would know what lay behind that innocent-looking rock. His mind full of his find, he slowly toiled his way to the top of Dumyat once more, then made his way back down to Aunt Elspeth's house. That night Gavin lay awake until very late, going over every moment of his day. He had not told Aunt Elspeth anything about the cave. He had still to find out who was using it and why. Tomorrow he would go back, hide himself in a good spot, and watch the entrance. He fell asleep and dreamed of falcons, secret caves, and high hills all mixed up together. He was weakened by water being splashed in his face. The window was open and rain was coming in. That's funny, thought Gavin as he stumbled out of bed to close it. I'm sure it was closed when I fell asleep last night. As he reached to pull down the sash, something on the sill caught his eye. He picked it up, put on the light, and examined it. It was a little cross made of 2 pieces of wood tied together with string. The ends of the wood were charred. Attached to it was a shred of red tartan. Fastened to the cross was a note. On it, printed in capital letters, was written, "Stay away." Chapter 6. The Hidden Watcher. Gavin awoke the next morning, nearly bursting with excitement. He could feel the wooden cross beneath his pillow. Whoever had put it on his windowsill must have climbed up the ivy. That meant someone light. The ivy was not very safe. Gavin knew he had tried it. It must have been one of the 3 children he had seen. But why did they want him to stay away? Was it their cave he had found? Did the bows and boxes and the jewelled dagger belong to them? His head in a turmoil, he went downstairs for breakfast. He sat on the bottom step and pondered. Yes, he would ask Aunt Elspeth's advice. But he wouldn't say anything about the cave yet. He pushed open the door and went in. "You're late," said Aunt Elspeth. "Did you oversleep?" "Yeah, I did a bit," Gavin admitted. "Aunt Elspeth, can you tell me what this might be?" He laid the cross with its shred of tartan on the table. He kept the note in his pocket. His aunt picked it up. "Well," she said, "it looks like a fiery cross. Where did you get it?" Gavin hesitated. I found it," he said at last. "What's a fiery cross?" "Long ago, when the chiefs of the clans wanted to call all their people together, generally to go to war, they sent a runner around all the little towns and villages. He carried a cross made of wood, and the ends were set alight. Whenever people saw the runner and the cross, they knew that they had to make their way quickly as possible to the gathering ground. The runner didn't need to stop. Everyone knew what the sign meant. But there are no fiery crosses nowadays. It must be a game." Gavin asked, "What's the little bit of tartan for?" "What tartan?" said his aunt. "Oh, so there is. I didn't notice it." She examined it carefully. "I don't know what it's for. They never attached tartan to a fiery cross in the old days. At least, I've never heard of such a thing. It's Stuart tartan," she added as an afterthought. Gavin was interested in this business of summoning the clan. "Were there many clans?" he asked. "Och, dozens," replied his aunt. "If you go along to your uncle's library sometime, you can look through some of his books. He'll tell you all about it. You're a member of a clan, you know." "I am?" said the surprised Gavin. "Yes," said Aunt Elspeth. "Your mother's name was Macrae. Your father is English, but if you ever wanted to wear a kilt, you could wear the Macrae. Some of the tartan books don't like people wearing their mother's tartan, but I think it's all right. Do you remember the picture above the door in the library?" she continued. "Well, you'll see the Macrae tartan there. It's a fine bright shade of red. But that's enough talking for today. Eat your breakfast. What do you plan to do this morning? Would you like a packet of sandwiches and a flask?" "Oh, yes, please," said Gavin. "I'm going back up Dumyat today. I might see the peregrine again," he added carefully. "Very well," said his aunt. "By the same route?" Gavin nodded. "Right then, off you go," she said. "But watch yourself if you go near the cliffs. Grass can be very slippy in the summer. Don't go near the edges." "Right," said Gavin. Half an hour later, Gavin was hurrying along the woodland path to the foot of the hills. As he went, he decided on a change of plan. "I'll have to find a different way up," he thought. "Then, if anyone is keeping a lookout for me, they won't expect me to arrive that way." He halted for a moment and spread his map on the ground. He thought it funny that one day's practice could turn these lines and colours and hores into reality, and his mind. He traced his journey up the Craigomas zigzag path, over the top of the hill to the glen, then up towards the top of Dumyat. He scanned the map. Along the foot of Dumyat on one side ran a wood. A path was marked through it. "If I go along the path," thought Gavin, "I would be hidden by the trees until I am below the bottom of the cliffs where I found the cave. That way, I could climb up from the wood. It would be easier than going up the top of the hill then clambering down again. Besides, the only place I could be in the open would be on the slopes, between the wood and the trees at the entrance to the hidden valley. Great. He would be in cover practically the whole way up." He closed the map and he set off. As he entered the wood, he glanced back. He stopped, puzzled. For a moment, he had thought that a man was crouching behind some trees, watching him. As he looked again, He could see nothing but the green of the trees and the dark shadows beneath them. Must be my imagination, he thought. Then a black and white bird shot clattering out of the trees and fluttered down in a gliding flight. Gavin swung his rucksack off his shoulders and took out his book of birds. He flipped through the illustrations. Black and white bird, long tail, jerky flight, a kick, a kick, kick, cry. A picture caught his eye. A magpie! He jotted the name and the date down in his notebook, then hurried on. It was good seeing the magpie, he thought. He was seeing a lot of new birds. Probably he had scared it into fluttering out of the trees just then. But Gavin was wrong. It wasn't him that had scared the magpie. Hidden in the trees and watching him climb up the hill was a man in dark clothing. He waited until Gavin was out of sight. Then he vanished among the trees.